So I think we'll get 4 properties. First one, St. Dominic's Church, Unionport Road, the Bronx Fire Alarm Telegraph Station, kind of like on the cusp of, well, I'd say Venice and West Farms, but very close in the vicinity of the 180th Street Station. Stokely Carmichael's residence, which is not just his residence, but his residence and 3 other sort of cookie cutter duplicate homes, which have been listed on the AIA, so which are very architecturally significant in nature. And then Engine 90, Ladder 41 on 1843 White Plains Road. So we'll take a look at the first one, St. Dominic's Church. So, so I put here a bunch of slides and photos I've taken from various angles and different places to show you a good representation of some of the architecture that's representative of St. Dominic's Church. We'll talk about the bell tower, the windows, the colonnade separating the windows, the ocular window. But the image on the far right is from further up Unionport Road, and you get a good sense of it. So we could go on to the next slide. So this is a good map. This is from about 1905, circa 1908, roundabout. I put the star there because that's the spot where St. Dominic's Church would be. And generally, everybody pretty much knows, hopefully, that the pink usually represents, if I'm not mistaken, the concrete structures or structures made out of brick. The yellow generally tends to represent buildings that were made out of wood or wood clapboard houses. So at this time, Van Est, because of the railroad station of the New Haven, was in play in about the mid-1850s, of course, and it was beginning to be a thriving neighborhood for immigrants, particularly Irish, then eventually Italians eventually. So, but this was one of the last spots where the
Jeez, there's people so much and and annoying that is.
Where you see the green star, where St. Dominic's Church would be. So you can go advance to the next slide. So the motivation for the church, of course, as we said, just like everything else, immigration was a motivating factor. German, Irish, eventually Italian, Irish immigration. And it was always known that, of course, Irish were there first, and before that Germans, and so on and so on. But the real church, and even today, was considered, in past maybe 30, 40 years, that Our Lady of Solace was considered the Irish parish and St. Dominic's the Italian parish. So the Irish parish was there, Our Lady of Solace, at 1674 White Plains Road. As Italian immigrants were moving in, they didn't have their own church per se. So, and of course, culturally, it's 2 different cultures and ethnic groups, and, everybody needs their own pride of place, so to speak. So, of course, Italians would eventually begin to build their own church, and they started initially at 667 Morris Park Avenue, which was a movie theater, and then eventually would become and manifest itself into Van Est Hardware, which is still around. So you can go to the next slide. And
also, if anyone has a question or a comment, please feel free to unmute yourself.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
So initially, this was where Our Lady of Solace Church was. Now it did become St. Dominic's Grammar School, which is now, a couple of years ago, it became a public school. But it's still under the auspices and still owned by St. Dominic's and the church. So this was originally Our Lady of Solace. They would eventually move to Morris Park Avenue and between Holland and Wallace. Wallace and Hunt, and their school was between Wallace and Holland. So that's where Our Lady of Solace was. Again, mostly kind of an Irish parish, but again, with the influx of Italian immigrants, again, they wanted their own sort of space for themselves. So, and that's what led us to St. Dominic. So, but we could progress to the next slide. Not to get too heavy, but I just put some stuff here about the main sort of driving force for St. Dominic, who was Father Fiorentino, and I kind of highlighted some stuff here. So as we said, it had its beginnings at 667 Morris Park Avenue, St. Dominic's Church, with approximately 106 congregants. And they broke ground for the new church on, or the church, on May 31st, 1925, and the cornerstone was laid in October of that year. And the church was designed by Bronx architect Anthony DiPace, and it was formally opened August 25th, 1926. So the church is definitely on its way to becoming a centurion at best. Stained glass windows were made in Munich, Bavaria by Ernst Fabrice, and he contributed to the mosaic art as well. And additionally, there was
I'm not watching that.
Carrara marble that was part of the church as well. So you progress to the next slide. This is just an article from Bronx Times about the church itself, and we'll get a little more into the architectural details coming up. So you can move on to the next slide. This is just from the Bronx, for the New York Times, stating how the church was eventually going to be dedicated, and it was done within a 2-year time period. So you can move on to the next slide. This one, you should actually skip this one and put a little, just too much heavy in detail. We'll get to the next one a little more, slides a little bit more easy to get through. So some good things about what this type of architecture was. It's a Romanesque. So very simply, the walls, building material, depending on the location, brick was customary. Usually limestone was part of it, granite, flintstone as well. The arches, I had mentioned earlier, the windows had what was called a colonnette. So you had 2 windows and a post in between those 2 arched windows, and that was kind of indicative of Romanesque architecture. And of course, the ocular windows were particularly in the front part of the building. So those are some characteristics of what type of architecture this was, Romanesque, and we could see that in the building itself, so the church. So this is another picture of the church itself, and again, we could see the ocular window and the colonnade on the bottom left, and how the windows work. So move on to the next slide. Again, same thing, we could see the ocular window and the church tower bell. So, and just a postcard of the church itself, and also in the next slide, another postcard of the interior of the church as well too, if you move on to the next slide. So again, good example of Romanesque architecture, and the fact that it's nearing its 100th anniversary is very significant. So, and again, the architect was pretty much known for making a lot of churches throughout the Bronx during his time period. So and that's just the 1940s tax photo as well of the church. So, so we can move on to the next building, which is the Bronx Fire Alarm Telegraph Station on East 180th Street, just west of Morris Park Avenue. Good, important building. Been around a long time. There's 3 others like them that are landmarks, and it's unfortunate that this one isn't. And sometimes we take it for granted. Oh, well, you know, it'll be there, you know, until the fire department decides that, you know what, we don't need this building anymore, and they move out. That's not a good thing. So especially something like that, if its counterpart in Brooklyn is landmark, this definitely I think should be as well landmarked. So we can move on to the next slide. This is just a map. I didn't get the particular date on it, but obviously it doesn't show the New York, Westchester, and Boston. New York, Westchester, and Boston came about around 1912, so this is probably prior to 1912. But we can move on to the next slide. This is a close-up. This is about roughly turn of the century, 1905. And usually what they would do with these maps, they would put updates onto the map. So yeah, the map is 1905 approximately, but of course they always add updates. And as you go on to the next slide, you'll see a little bit close-up of the building we're talking about right over there where it says Bronx Park on the top. And there's our bureau, Bronx Central Office Bureau of Fire Alarm Telegraph. So it's right there, right on the corner by Bronx Park Avenue. And of course, it was a fireproof construction, as you can see on the left-hand side of this key. So it was really kind of a substantial building for its day, so which is significant. Good picture. The thing about it was there was no accounting of the tax photo of this building in either the 1940s or the 1980s. So I managed to get one from the Department of Records. I think it was might have been from Parks. So we could see that where the building is located right there. And at this point, this is 1934. The New York, Westchester, and Boston was already up and rolling. It would be another 3 years until the Westchester and Boston would be defunct, and then it would be taken over by the MTA. So we could, next slide will show it a little bit closer. There's a little bit closer view of the Bronx Telegraph building. So a really good image of it. So
someone is asking in the chat, what was this building's purpose?
we're going to get to that in the next couple of slides. So just before we get to that, the architecture, Italian Renaissance Revival. You'll notice a little later on the triple arch entry loggia, hip roof, was designed by architect Frank J. Hemley. That's how I pronounce his name correctly. The Bronx fire alarm telegraph stations, they were constructed. It says, I don't know if you can see the date there because of, let's see, that's there. Constructed in 1913, 1950, and not placed into service until the new alarm systems they were built to interface were not completed. They really didn't go into service in the Bronx until 1923. They were a way to the way we have our 9/11 system in order to notify different firehouses of where a fire was. That's what they basically were. They were designed to do, to communicate to different firehouses throughout the city, and in this case, particularly in the Bronx, to contact the local fire station where the fire was in order to send out the appropriate trucks to fight that fire. So it went up about 1913. It wasn't put into use until 1923, until the entire system, the entire telegraph system was put into place. So this is definitely a 100-year building and more. So just a little bit about the architect himself. He was joined the firm of McKim, Mean and White, born in Marietta, Ohio, and influenced by the White Cities movement, which was a movement designed to have really sort of this type of high-end upscale architecture throughout much of the cities throughout, Detroit and different places like that. The thinking was that if you build it, they will come, basically, kind of thinking for what I've been reading about this idea of White Cities movement and more kind of upscale architecture in cities. So to get a more sort of higher clientele, so to speak, in many of the cities throughout either Detroit or other places like that. So,
okay.
So we go on to the next slide.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes
Yes,
left.
certainly, that's fine.
Okay.
We could skip this. It's just characteristics of Renaissance revival. We'll see that in the next coming slide. So you could move on from this. So there's just a picture of it. The arches, the balusters. Move on to the next photo. Next slide. So definitely, again, triple arches and the hip roof, four-sided roof. Move on to the next slide.
Okay, Ariella Hillman is asking, did they notify the firehouse by telegraph?
From what I gather, what I would think that was probably the most current way of communicating. So yeah, I would think by that would be how they would notify the firehouse. Whether anybody knows any better, then that's from what I gather they would do it. So, so we can move on to the next slide. If we're pressed for time, I don't want to cut into anybody else's time. So this is 1129 East 180th Street. We can move to the next slide because I want to get to the last building. And the last building, Stogie Carmichael's residence. So that's on Amethyst Street, just off of Morris Park Avenue. Known for, this is from his book, the cover of his book, known for the phrase Black Power. So we can move on to the next slide. I didn't have a date on this map, but I'm certain it's probably around turn of the century, 1900s. The green square box shows the 4 houses that we're talking about. So we can move on to the next slide. Again, a lot of stuff here. It just shows that when the father bought the house, he said that it was really a dump and that they managed to clean it up and really make a go of it. So he originally was from Harlem, and then he moved up to 1810 Amethyst Street in Van Nest in 1953. So there's the house again with a little more, or the group of houses with a little more development, and not too far off from Public School 34, where he did attend. So move on to the next slide. Here's the tax photo of the house. Again, there's 4 of them together and very architecturally significant. I wasn't able to find much in terms of the particular type of architecture or style of it. If anybody knows it, that'd be great. And to add to it, that'd be wonderful. I know it was listed in the AIA a great many number of years ago as architecturally significant building. So that's just the property transfer that I had gotten a number of years back when it was sold from a gentleman named Berkowitz to his father, Adolphus Carmichael, so in 1953. And they sold the property in the next slide in 1986. The mother was still alive, Mabel. She was living in Florida, and that's when they had sold the property officially. So again, he's known for the Black Power movement, especially in the 1950s, 60s, so civil rights movement. This is a picture from when we were on the Ravioli to Cannoli tour in front of his house a number of years ago. So we can move on to the next slide and just very quickly get through the firehouse, engine 90. This is a photo from Peter Osiander, Kingsbridge Historical Society, found this for me. So you just see where it was built. It's on White Plains Road, just west of Morris Park Avenue, or rather north, I should say. There's a present day picture of it. Built in 1906, if I'm not mistaken. So again, this is a Centurion, a little more than a Centurion building. So it's been around a while and definitely worthy of hopefully it being landmarked at best. And again, there's just a picture when we were on the Ravioli to Cannoli tour about 8 years ago. So that's about it. So we said it was, this is the last slide. It was city bought the land for $6,000. It was a 50 by 100 lot. And it went into use on April 17th, 1906. So definitely something very historical and worthy of recognition. So.
All right, thanks so much, Richard.
Thank
you. Now we're gonna move to Parkchester and Unionport.
Unionport, yeah.
Unionport.
A little misspelled there, but it is Unionport.
All right,
and
Unionport.
Ravioli to Cannoli tour is hard to kind of you know, follow up after. It was actually the firehouse is right next to my grandfather's house. He used to live right there.
Oh, wow.
Islander.
Nice.
So it's funny seeing that. Very small neighborhoods, and they're all next to each other. So I guess we'll go to my next slide. So favorite buildings of Parkchester and Unionport. And what I'm going to do is, first I want to thank everyone who's been following me on Instagram who actually is showing up here. So I'm going to take everyone through a little bit of the background on it. Before this was Parkchester. This was the Catholic Protectory. It was basically a home for children. It would be basically what we would consider foster care housing for just kids, and they trained them in skills. So here, if you see to the right, you'll see it's cane seat making. I was able to acquire this print from one of the early newspapers. That was, I believe, the principal of the school. They had its own church. The building in itself was magnificent. Actually, when MetLife bought the property, the Protectory was almost all 129 acres, and they added a little bit as they were growing the vision of Parkchester, but that was all their land. The building in and of itself, if they would have left it there, would have been an amazing thing because it existed from the Civil War era to right there in 1939 when they bought it, when they demolished it. It's one of those things that you look at and you go, it's a shame, because that would have been really cool to see. So before there was Parkchester, there was Catholic Protectory. As you can see, the land on the right-hand side, you'll see how it sits there, and what it is you'll see all the different buildings, and Parkchester itself was named after Park Versailles and Westchester. Unionport actually is one of the crossing points there. The name Parkchester is a combination of both Park Versailles and Westchester. But that map off to the side kind of shows you what they were looking at when they were doing land mapping of purchasing the property. Next slide. So this is Frederick Eckertz, and he was a man who worked for MetLife. He was a man of vision. He was a very cold man and a very driven man. I would say that Parkchester was part of his big plan because MetLife was trying to come up with a new way of making money towards the end of the Great Depression. Creating housing was something that they were looking into. They really envisioned this as the best of the best. Affordable housing for the workers of New York City, and they viewed it as like a feeder. You live up in the Bronx, but you're gonna be taking the train, and the train station was the selling point to go into the city to work. This enabled you to have affordable housing and amenities. And Parkchester, when it was designed, had a great deal of amenities. One of the things that are pivotal about the plan of Parkchester, and as you look at it on the left, the green sketch there was a sketch that was presented at the 1939 World's Fair, was first off, the iconic fountain is not present. It wasn't part of the original plan. It was something that was contracted. When they were at the 1939 World's Fair, they saw a lot of the artists there, and that's where they saw Ray Barger's work, and they kind of asked him to build out afterwards. The other aspect of Parkchester on the plan, and I'm doing this very topically because I go really much with the blog into the statues, is that it is unlike any other place in the fact that it was the largest planned housing of its time. It had postcards, it had ads, it had one of the largest campaigns you've ever seen for advertising for real estate to try to get people to come up here and live here. It had the first, actually the first Macy's outside of Manhattan was here and still is here, and it employed about 70% of the people of the area. And still does, actually. Not sure how it's doing right now because of COVID, but a lot of the people who lived in Parkchester work in Macy's. So the other pivotal aspect to this is the space. It's not buildings on top of each other. They have them spaced with park areas. The park area was a critical aspect to the construction of Parkchester. They wanted something that left your eye rested and gave people places to play and have just feel not as if you're in the typical city setup. But to me, also another aspect was during this time was polio. Polio was one of the things that they've already known that when you're in a congested area, a lot of people in one place on top of each other helps facilitate the spread of polio. It probably was one of the things factored because if you actually go around Parkchester, you will have plenty of space walking from each person to person. It's something that you can see in the spacing of Parkchester. Next slide. So talking about the World's Fair, once they went there and they were presenting their vision and they showed the floor, the overall map of it with the architects, the architectural firm who designed Parkchester also designed the Empire State Building. The people who designed the grounds of Parkchester were also the same people who designed the grounds of the 1939 World's Fair. So there's a lot of coincidences. There's a lot of similarities within the artists of who did what and the 1939 World's Fair. We're intricately tied to the World's Fair for Parkchester. So I have the picture here, and you'll see some pieces of some of our artists in that add off to the center. And then the overall look of the World's Fair at that point in time. Next slide. Okay, this is the man. This is the terracotta master. This is Carl Schmitz. He was originally in every single ad. He was a main part of the publication. One of the sadder things to see is that this man, ever since that era, his name kind of got phased out because, unfortunately, I feel that a German immigrant working on something like this during World War II era was not exactly something everyone wanted to see or hear about. A lot of the other artists got more of a exposure and credit in later years, but he's the terracotta master. He's the one who planned all the details and the aspects for it. So I'm gonna do this quickly. The photo off on top of the mother and child piece is a sculpture he did, and that was called Sorrow, and it's how he felt during the World War II era, being German in America as a German immigrant, trying to fit in and make his way, and I think it was one of the more difficult things. You'll see that sculpture and a sculpture he did for us, which is amazing, which is Mother Nature, which she's right off to the side. It's a very similar style, and actually I was able to acquire one of the original pieces here. If you can see it, I'm not sure because I think I'm tiny up here, but this is Mother Nature, and this is how he presented it when he went into MetLife. It's solid terracotta, it's signed. There's very slight differences, and it's the hair, because here she has bangs, and in the actual piece she doesn't. But those are just the nuances of it, but you can see her hugging the plant, and it's one of his pivotal pieces to his work was women, children, and this idea of nurturing and safety, which was something that they had wanted for the epitome of the place for the middle class to grow, this ideal utopia that they envisioned Parkchester to be. A couple of those other pieces that match, I have the coin that's on the screen. This Society of Metal piece right here is literally the mother and child. That's exactly the same piece we have up in Parkchester. And you'll see the daisy matching pieces. It's really cool. So I love Carl Schmitz, good guy. He also had a big spike for him as an artist with his pieces for the Verlies collection. For people who collect glass, he's one of the, this Verlies, it was out of France that they created an American wing, and he was one of the signature artists. All his pieces were signed. So that's Carl Schmitz. A couple of pieces that you see there are identified as his. I was able to confirm it. I want to also give credit at this point in time to the National Academy of Design, who helped me figure out who did what, because they had a lot of the original documentation. I did not have all of it because I was not able to trace all of the artists, but these few that I'm going to highlight now, I'll take you through. The next slide, please. This is Edmund Amatis, and he's one of my favorites. He's a legacy artist. He's also a veteran. He has done countless pieces, but he's known for his friezes, which you can clearly see with our doors. So the Tree of Life door, which is off the side where you see the gazelles, you'll also see some gazelle pieces. And those are very similar to Syrian art. You'll see him working on these large friezes off to the side in the American artist picture there. He was into this squash perspective. You'll see that with a few of the animals. I believe he's the artist behind all of those. But one piece that we have that's signed, and one of the few pieces that's signed, is his, and it's a girl with the doll. It's a little dismal. Some people are scared of it, but it's a signed piece, and it's an incredible thing because of who he was at the time and who he still stayed to be. He stayed in the art world, in architecture, creating different things for different parks, post offices, you name it. He was constantly working. Beyond Metals, here's his metal piece there. Beyond Metals, he literally was constantly working. He had pieces up until his death in the modern era. So that's Edmund Amatis. Next slide. Joseph Kozlowski, who is the American star of sculpture. Everyone loved him in his era. He was the son of immigrants. He was a great story. He's the one that everyone likes talking about. All of his pieces are signed. Now you have to know where to find them, and that's one of the cooler aspects of this. It's kind of like putting pieces of a puzzle together. But these are, you know, the gossip bench. It comes in 2 colors, and he also has the child feeding the dog. They're all signed. There's a 3rd piece that I believe is his, which is a Dutch girl, because it stays in the same style, but it's very hard to confirm it's not signed. Not every piece was signed. So, you know, it's pretty hard because when I tried to even get MetLife to help me, they didn't even have an archive. So it was a little tricky there. But all right, next. I have, oh, wait, no, we skipped someone. Let's go back. Yes, this is our fountain artist, Raymond Granville Barger, who is incredible. So the fountain, once it was selected, was based off of the Heinz building. The Heinz building is incredible. When you actually see the sketches of it, I wish I was there to actually see the live piece, because our fountain is incredible, but the sea maid from it is just an incredible statue. She was raising this seashell. She was she just looked female empowerment. It was an incredible statue. When you went inside of the building, they had Triumph. It was another woman that was in charge and powerful. He was known for these really large, massive metal sculptures, and I had no idea he actually worked on and created until I got confirmation, because I was able to find his promotional guide of a few of our terracotta pieces. So there's photos of the fountain. One of the original ads promoting the fountain that became postcards that they would promote the area. I put the sea maid so you get an idea of that. That's the same style. It was a narrative that he kind of flowed with. And then the top of the building. So part of the thing that got me some press was just discussing the fact that a lot of the buildings were missing the statues from the facades. His statues are the heaviest. And I originally believed them to be Carl Schmitt's because he was the terracotta master, but these are actually Raymond Granville Barger's pieces. And these photos I gotta give credit to, because AOC was the one who sent in the photos to me when she found them down. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, thank you so much for sending in the photos. These are Raymond Granville Barger's statues. They are very heavy pieces. If you are not familiar with how they were originally installed and you're doing facade work, you don't want to touch those pieces. And a lot of them were just removed because I think it was too difficult for them to work with. You had to have a very skilled train set to know how to deal with those statues. And I believe the recent work that was being done on the facades, they didn't have anyone who knew how to work with them. It's a shame because his pieces are probably one of the more valuable pieces to have, and they were all but removed. There are a few up. And that's my mom by the statue. I was born in Parkchester, and then we moved into Unionport and kind of gone back and forth. And, you know, we always love taking photos by the fountain. Fountain for us is your Instagram moment. I think everyone has photos by the Metropolitan and Oval Fountain. And that's thanks to Raymond Granville Barger. So thanks, Ray. Moving on to the next. Dollar Savings Bank. This is Arthur Crisp. This is his mural. I focused in on the art because this is my background. I'm an art director, so I kind of always love those things. And the architecture is something that I do as a hobby, looking it up. I never thought I would be having this opportunity to talk to people about this stuff, but I don't know what those questions are. Yes, for the bank, yes. So yeah, the bank is an incredible piece of architecture. It was actually, their press release for the bank was built in tandem to Parkchester, but it's technically on Unionport. So what happens is Westchester Avenue, you go one way, you're at Parkchester, the other side, you're in Unionport, and it's just a twist of fate. They used to have the Circle movie theater there that no longer is in operation and has had many lives. Even in my lifetime, it's been many a thing. That's right next door. But one of the things that makes this bank really stand out is the marble details, the typography that is emblazoned on like the doors and other things. It takes you straight to that 1940s era. And that mural is incredibly detailed, historically based, but I would also like to do something that is based from another perspective, because I think that's just one of those interesting pieces, the mural in and of itself and its content, especially in light of the world we're in now. So Dollar Savings Bank, amazing building. Arthur Crisp, who was a Canadian immigrant to the US. Next building, St. Helena's Church. So I was talking about Edmund Namatis, and I want to talk to you about St. Helena's, same building, 1940s. I mentioned it here because everyone who's gone and follows the blog has gone, so many people have gone to St. Helena's. But for me, one of the most interesting pieces is the frieze on the top of the doors. You have the Virgin Mary, and I believe that you have two other saints off to the side. It's a really cool piece. It's a standout piece for the detailing of the church. That's why I like St. Helena's. And the next church is Fourth Presbyterian. Fourth Presbyterian falls into Unionport. It was around before there was Parkchester's in the 1930s. It is very unique because the details on the top and its stained glass mural is American made and by American artists. And it is made with these chunky pieces of glass. To your point, when I believe you said St. Dominic's came out of Europe, this one's American. And it was from that era. So there's that. It's the tiles in the back. And what's interesting is for the 1930s, it was very modern on the inside. It's very clean, keeping with the Protestant religion. But it has these interesting nuances for the exterior because of those big yellow tiles that are really stand out. So that's why I really love Fourth Presbyterian. It's one of those standout pieces, and you see it everywhere you go because literally that yellow is very bright. So that's me taking you guys very quickly through Parkchester and Unionport, my favorite buildings, some of the identified artists, and yeah, I don't see any more questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That was really amazing. Now we're gonna move to Morrisania with Marianne.
Okay. All right, thank you. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when Diego proposed this this meeting, he said he wanted people to talk about the places that were significant to them personally in their neighborhood. And I said, oh, I have to think about it because almost every place that meant something to me is gone. So they're all gone. But I could only think of one that was still there and that was personally significant to me. I mean, there's a lot of other historically significant places, but they didn't really have like a place in my life. The places that had a role in my life that meant something to me, that were beautiful to me. This is really all that's left, but it's a corker. This is the Morrisania branch of the New York Public Library. So we'll start with a little history, which a lot of you probably know. Around 1900, 120 years ago or so, the robber baron turned philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie, announced that he would be giving money to build public libraries in the Bronx and in Manhattan, and the city would pay for the land. And plans were made for sites in the Bronx, in Mott Haven, and in Tremont. But the people in Morrisania, and Morrisania at the time was overall kind of a middle class to affluent area. It was like the one time in history that this area was affluent to middle class. It started out poor and today it's poor again. But they submitted a petition signed by more than 1,500 people living in the area to the New York Public Library Site Committee and the city agency in charge. And they asked them to, quote, locate a Carnegie Library at or near the junction of 169th Street and Boston Road, end quote. And they cited the 40,000 people living in the area, that's a lot of people for those days. And they said that the Mott Haven and Tremont branches would be too far away to be easily accessible to the Morrisania population, which I think was fair. I think that was an accurate statement. And also a special letter came from the principal of Morris High School, which had not yet opened at its present site, on Boston Road and 166th Street. It was still a little further downtown near 3rd Avenue in the 150s. And he wrote a letter to these committees, and he said that it would be really important for the students at Morris High School, which was the first public high school in the Bronx, to have a full, like a full library nearby. And the community got its wish. The library, which was at first named the McKinley Square branch, opened in 1908. And the site and the location are excellent. It's an expansive site, and it curves where Franklin Avenue crosses 169th Street, allowing a freestanding building. Now, a lot of libraries are not freestanding. Tremont's not freestanding. Mott Haven is, but usually they're not. But this is a freestanding building with 2 lower story wings, and you can see one of the wings over here, and there's one hidden by the trees. And they're set back from the sidewalk. You can see that there are little lawns behind iron gates and stone posts enclosing the small lawns. And in the center, there are steps leading to a beautiful entrance. And later on, we'll see some of the details of this gorgeously framed entrance. Also, the site is at the crest of the Mid-Bronx Ridge. The Bronx is, the West Bronx is crossed north, in a north-south direction by 3 ridges. And this is at the top of the Mid-Bronx Ridge, the furthest east ridge, and it's one of the highest elevations in the Bronx. Also, in front of the library are 2 open spaces, McKinley Square to the east and Beatty Plaza, which is named after a World War I war hero, to the west. And so as a walker approaching it from any direction, you see this building unobscured by buildings in front of it or beside it. And you see it in its full beauty. And also, as you get closer, you see how it's so generously bedecked with delicious architectural details and the most opulent materials. Okay, so could we move to slide 2, please? Okay, so this is the inside soon after it first opened, the reading rooms, and like all the Carnegie libraries, the furniture and the light fixtures were of the highest quality. Okay, let's go to slide 3. Okay, and this is the staircase. It's a spacious staircase, and you see this luxurious window letting in so much light, and you see the light fixture, which is beautiful in a simple way. And this led to the 2nd floor. Let's look at and on the 2nd floor was the children's room, which was a special section full of books, especially for young people. Okay, so that was the early days of the library. Okay, let's go on to slide 5. Okay, so this is the library in modern times. And this is what I saw as a young child. When I was just beginning to read, I lived on Park Avenue, which is in the valley, in the depths of the valley between the Bronx Ridge that the Concourse runs on and the Mid-Bronx Ridge that the library is on. So to get to the library, I would walk up the Mid-Bronx Ridge along 169th Street. And as I passed Fulton Avenue and got to the block near Franklin Avenue, there would appear on my right this library, this gorgeous building. And by then it had been renamed the Morrisania Library, which I think was a step in the right direction, because I think McKinley was an imperialist, and I could say a lot of other bad things about him. So I think Morrisania, not that Morris was so great either. He was from a slave-owning family, but you know, you run out of names at a certain point. Okay, so in my life, there was no other public building that was so beautiful. There were beautiful churches in the area, but I didn't belong to any church. My family was Jewish, and they didn't even go to synagogue. And the other public buildings that were in my life were my school, PS2, which was built in the 50s and was very boring and utilitarian, and the health center next to it, which was pretty much the same deal, boring, utilitarian. But here was this gorgeous building, and I could go in it. And so that made me feel like really happy and special. And when I went inside, I saw the same kind of beautiful furniture and floors and light fixtures, as you saw in the early shots. Everything was clean and shiny and glossy. And then there was this palatial staircase that I could climb up to the children's section, and I could take books home. And I love books and I love to read. So this was just so exciting to me. And I really, really loved this library. So those were my impressions as a little kid. So, you know, there were a lot of things I didn't know. I didn't know that the architectural firm that I didn't need to know. The architectural firm that designed it, Babb, Cook, and Willard, that they were very renowned, and that they had actually designed Carnegie's own mansion on 92nd Street in Manhattan, which is now the Cooper Hewitt Museum of the Smithsonian chain of museums. I didn't have to know that it was, quote, classical revival style, and that the base was pink Milford granite. It could fill me with elation without my knowing those details. Okay, let's go on to slide 6. Next slide. Okay, and I didn't know that the building was topped by a stone cornice embellished with an egg and dart molding. In fact, I had to look up egg and dart myself just now. Egg and dart molding is like, this is egg and dart molding. It's like little ovals, sculpted ovals with like little arrows or something in between. I didn't know that it had a dental course. I had no idea what a dental course is. A dental course is a horizontal line of bricks, one of which protrudes and the other of which recedes. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. This is the entrance, and it's a limestone portico. It has decorative iron grills. It has a historic light feature. Those light fixtures are still there. And it has a semicircular transom. It has a keystone. Here's the keystone. It has dentals, those alternating bricks. And it has a paneled parapet. Here's the paneled parapet. Okay, let's go to the next. And it had a relief of the city seal above it. And all of this made an impression on me without my analyzing it or knowing the specific details. And it was a bright spot in a life that was often otherwise very sad and difficult. Okay, let's go on to slide 9. So when I revisit the library today, it was landmarked in 1998. which was like 90 years after it opened. It's just as pristine, just as lovely. You can see that floor is still shining. And the first floor, I didn't want to take their pictures because I felt that that would be an invasion of their privacy, but it's full of people from the community. They're sitting at lovely wooden tables. They're reading books. They're reading periodicals. They're very quietly speaking to each other. I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, this is the staircase today, and that's the head librarian, who I'll mention later. The staircase is just as beautiful. The light that infuses it, just as beautiful. Okay, next slide is next slide. This is the children's section. It looks a lot different than it did in 1908 or even in my day. It's no longer the same serious, somber air as the adult section. Let's go on to the next slide. It's full of colorful decorations and posters. And next slide. Okay, and it's got child-sized chairs and round tables. I was a serious little kid, but I can see how this would be more welcoming and enticing for most children. So I spoke to Mr. Nembhard, the chief librarian, who you saw climbing up the steps, and he was very proud and happy as he described to me all the community outreach programs that the branch is involved in, and they're bringing literacy and books and the love of reading into the community, not just waiting for people to come to the library. But the full rooms of people showed me that the whole community did feel welcome and that the library was like a home to them. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Marianne. It was very informative. And lastly, we're gonna move to Woodlawn, our last neighborhood in the Bronx that we're gonna be talking about today with Susan Olsen.
Oh, I need to unmute. Hold on.
Yeah, you're on mute now. We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
Yay. All right. So it seems that it's always Woodlawn is always at the end. This is an aerial view of Woodlawn Cemetery. And I assume everybody is familiar with us. Woodlawn is a National Historic Landmark. I think we have 7 National Historic Landmarks in the Bronx now. And we have one within this. The Admiral Farragut gravesite is also a National Historic Landmark. So we're very proud of that. And as far as my life goes and why I picked what I picked in Woodlawn is I've lived in the Woodlawn neighborhood for almost 20 years now. I moved to New York City from Tallahassee, Florida. And of course, it was very frightening when you move to New York that you need a safe, affordable place to live. And so I ended up at Woodlawn, which is adjacent to work, so I don't have to commute, which is a pretty terrific arrangement. As far as the cemetery goes, and I think what's been interesting in listening to everybody else is the common thread of the railroad. That is why the cemetery is where it is, because of Metro North. We know that Cornelius Vanderbilt buys the Harlem North Railroad. He needed businesses along the railroad. Even though we did have an altruistic vision for the cemetery, it was primarily a moneymaker. Vanderbilt needed businesses. His son-in-law was on our first board of trustees, and we start to develop the cemetery. What's interesting about Woodlawn is we have 1,300 buildings, private family mausoleums within the confines of it, a chapel that was built in 1935, but our main office at Webster and East 233rd has been altered many times, but part of it does date from 1864 when the cemetery was founded. Metro North was the first thing to get here, but then what I know is that our board of trustees, as the Gilded Age was coming to a close, knew that they would need a new population, new customers for the cemetery. So they lobbied very heavily and were extremely disappointed that the Grand Concourse did not make it to Woodlawn. So they rallied and, of course, continued to push until in 1917, the subway makes it to Woodlawn. So it became easy for new customers to be attracted. What's remarkable about the cemetery is in many ways it reflects the transient nature of the Bronx, where initially people came up here from Manhattan and they were Gilded Age patrons. Then in 1917, the number 4 connects us to all of New York City. We become the primary cemetery of the Harlem Renaissance with a large African-American population. And of course, today, again, the transient nature of the Bronx, we have a large Italian segment here. When the Italians were moving into the Bronx and taking over, now we have a large Hispanic section. Not so much sections, but that's who today's customers are as an active cemetery. So we reflect how people have come into the Bronx and different ethnic groups in the 1870s. If you look at the far northern section of the cemetery, it's primarily a German population. So you can see how the cemetery has changed in the same way that the Bronx has. The other thing that's interesting is for those of you who are genealogists, there are many early cemeteries, including the Morrisania Cemetery, was moved here. A lot of the large rural cemeteries made money off of development in the city. The small cemeteries would come here, and we've got a lot of records from the small cemeteries that were moved from other parts of the borough, primarily from Manhattan though, to Woodlawn. Okay, next image. This is where I live. This is the apartment building that was built in the late 20s, early 30s, on the corner of Vireo in East 234th Street. What's important about the Woodlawn neighborhood is we're sort of this bizarre postage stamp at the end of the Bronx, not really fully connected to the borough because we're surrounded by the cemetery in Van Cortlandt Park. So we're segregated by a lot of green space, and it has made the neighborhood stay pretty resilient to deliver to any kind of change, both in the population. Families have been able to hold on to their properties, and the neighborhood basically grew up around the cemetery. The cemetery had an enormous workforce, but it also had tremendous work opportunity for people. If you were a marble sculptor, it was a great place to live. If you were a granite cutter, if you were a monument dealer, if you were a florist, Woodlawn, the neighborhood, again, as I've researched the census reports to see who made this neighborhood home, it was cemetery workers and the businesses associated with the cemetery. My apartment building was built by the O'Connell family. The O'Connells still own a great deal of property in the Woodlawn neighborhood. And so they saw the opportunity to build this big apartment building. There's a studio building, there's garage buildings, there's this building, there's that building. And I think it's remarkable that a family has been able to pass down ownership of these properties for multiple generations, which has enabled people like me to live in the same apartment building for almost 20 years. It has created a sense of residency in the Woodlawn neighborhood we're just not very transient in comparison to many other Bronx locations. Again, it's a typical 36-unit building with brick and stone. It's primarily granite and is just a fantastic place to live. There aren't very many people in New York that live just a few feet from work, and I consider that a luxury. The other thing that's been interesting as I've studied my building is in many ways it was a dormitory for cemetery workers. Most of the early occupants of the building, back when it was built at the dawn of the Great Depression, were cemetery workers. And so the cemetery folks and their families, and again, what's convenient about the building is it's only 2 blocks from Metro North. So today it continues to be a very desirable property because of the ability to commute and get somewhere else. Next image. Now, if you were facing my apartment building and you look to the right, you would see this marvelous little house, which is in disrepair. And this was the cemetery superintendent's house. It does date from the late 1870s. There was an initiative to landmark it. It, of course, was owned for almost its entire history by the Deering family. Henry Deering was a German immigrant and came over here and ended up being the superintendent. As the superintendent of the cemetery, he was primarily responsible for the landscaping. What I've learned about Woodlawn is that the engineer took on the responsibility of monument building and foundations and the development of the roadways, but the superintendent was responsible for the planting of the trees, the gardens that existed, the maintenance of those. So he was primarily a landscape artist. What's interesting, and I've never been in the house, is that it does have a garden structure in it. If I win the lottery, I'm buying this house, because to be able to develop it for continued use, it backs up to the cemetery maintenance yard. It's adjacent to my apartment building. I know Henry Deering, when he retired as the superintendent of Woodlawn at the turn of the century, his son, Fred, took over the job. So for 50 continuous years, we had the same family overseeing the development of the gardens, the trees of Woodlawn, and Woodlawn is now an arboretum. But it's a remarkable structure. I do believe it is still for sale. It needs a phenomenal amount of work. And what our fear is in the Woodlawn neighborhood, those of us who reside there, is because we are such a convenient commuter with the Metro North, as well as the fact that we are adjacent to the hospitals, we're seeing quite a change in our neighborhood now. As you know, if you work at Montefiore Hospital, you want to live at Woodlawn because you can walk to work, or you can just take the bus around the cemetery and you're at the big Montefiore Hospital. So there's great fear that it will be torn down and apartments, et cetera, will be built, a more modern facility, and that we'll lose this absolutely wonderful building, which has such significance as far as the families who decided to build on Woodlawn and make the cemetery neighborhood their home. Next image. So in the 20 years that I've been at Woodlawn, what I have focused my studies on as a historian is the monuments. You know, I'm equally interested in the famous people that are there, from Duke Ellington to Celia Cruz to Joseph Pulitzer. Of course, this week, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with the statue being unveiled on downtown, the fact that Woodlawn is her final resting place means we're a pilgrimage site. We get thousands of people from all over the world that come to the cemetery to pay their respects to those who influenced their lives and changed our culture, etc. What I care about, though, is the people that built these monuments. And what I know as far as the Woodlawn neighborhood goes, this grand house was the home of Robert Caterson. Caterson comes to Woodlawn. There are several members of the Caterson family, and they get in the monument business. Adjacent to the entrance of the cemetery, Samuel Cockburn is still there. Caterson's business was there for years and years and years. And when he passed on, the business was sold, and it was about 10 years ago that it finally closed down. The guy who bought the property at East 233rd, across from the cemetery, gave me 2 weeks to clean it out. So I was able to get the records of Robert Caterson so that we knew more about who constructed the monuments, architects involved, stone involved, and fantastic early pictures of Woodlawn and some of the monumentation. Our records are at Columbia University. It was 14 years ago that Columbia realized we had the architectural plans, not only for our buildings, but for the mausoleums. So the work of, excuse me, John Russell Pope, who gives us the Jefferson Memorial, McKim, Mead and White, Carrere and Hastings, all the major architectural firms built things for their clients at Woodlawn. But also within the collection at Columbia, and I will apologize, something I never do, for not showing you the early maps. When Woodlawn was farmland, those maps are all at Columbia. The early maps of the Woodlawn neighborhood are all at Columbia. Some of the promotional things for when the Grand Concourse. So a lot of our neighborhood history in this region based upon the development, I think one of my favorite things in the Avery collection is the taking. When the Bronx becomes the Bronx in 1898, of course we know that, if you were the Commissioner of Roads, Heinz, you were the most powerful person on the planet because you got to decide where the streets went. Heinz is buried at Woodlawn, but there is a stitched together photograph that's 36, I think it's about 36 feet long, where our guys took a picture and stepped and went every few feet to put together the fence line before the city decided to take the fence line. So the retaining walls that you see outside the cemetery on 233rd and Webster Avenue, where there were enormous lawsuits, there were issues as far as widening the roads and taking the roads, all those records are at the Avery Archives. And I don't think many of us who are studying Bronx history realize that within the Woodlawn collection, you can find a lot of fantastic documentation about the Bronx, the roadways, and the transportation to get to the cemetery and our activities about that, as well as the families who lived in the neighborhood. Well, as far as meaningful buildings, Caterson's one of my favorite monument dealers. But what I've learned is that the streets that radiate out on the northern end of the cemetery, it was monument land. The reason that Woodlawn as a neighborhood had so many Italian immigrants was because Americans didn't know how to carve marble. It was much easier to bring an Italian in, have them settle in the Bronx, have them do the statuary, and have all the monument companies. They lined the streets where nowadays we've got a mobile station on the corner. That was Presby Leland's Monument Company. Setson Bianchi was there, Peter Saley. There were all these Italian firms with their stone carvers, and of course the residents lived in the Woodlawn neighborhood. We went from being a large German population. Today we know we still have a large Irish population, but we also had a huge Italian population. At one time period, we employed 450 people on our landscape crew. And again, we have the records of those individuals, their little photographs, their employment cards. So if we wanted to do a demographic study of the people who lived in this neighborhood, who worked at the cemetery, where they came from, what they looked like, we've never thrown anything out. So those records are there. Caterson, of course, the builder of the Huntington Mausoleum, he owned a mountain in Texas. He built Leland Stanford's mausoleum on the Stanford University campus, was just a remarkable contractor that did amazing things. And a lot of the stone that was supplied for the city and a lot of the buildings that some of you have discussed today, these monument dealers were heavily involved because they owned quarries and they brought the stone here to New York City. So what I think is important about my neighborhood and about Woodlawn is we've never really done a serious study of who built these houses, who the residents were, the permanent things that we have all over the city that were created by these folks. I think we've got the ability, because so many of those residences still stand because of the segregation that takes place by the green space, that what we can do as far as studying, documenting, landmarking, et cetera, the Woodlawn neighborhood is pretty remarkable. And again, the thing that I wanted to share with everyone is, God, I wish somebody would save good old Fred Deering's house and Henry Deering's home. But I think